Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Wanted, a top-notch diplomat to help guide us out of the European Union and steer us through the most difficult, indeed crucial set of negotiations this country has faced in living memory. Must be highly experienced in negotiating with our continental neighbours and highly respected by both sides. You might think it odd that it's only a matter of months before the Prime Minister presses the button for the ejector seat from Europe, weeks perhaps, and we don't have anyone doing this vitally important job. But we did, and he's resigned. Not only resigned, but we now know fired off a letter attacking the government for muddled thinking and ill-founded arguments in its approach to Brexit. So we need someone else, and pronto. And it's got to be someone, it seems, who's sympathetic to the government's approach to Brexit. Who might that be? Well, Jonathan Powell was Chief of Staff to Tony Blair from 1997 to 2007, probably knows more about how the system works than any other living human being. And Iain Duncan Smith from the other side, that is the political side, former Tory leader, prominent Eurosceptic, former minister, of course, who is also on the line. Jonathan Powell, Sir Ivan Rogers was our man in Brussels. He's now left. What do you make of the way in which he's left and the reasons for it?
I think it's really quite a big problem. Ivan worked with me in number 10 Downing Street. He was our principal private secretary when I was there. And he'd also worked for the Tories. He'd been on both sides. He'd worked for Ken Clarke, and he'd worked with Tories and Labour governments. And he's been a classic civil servant of being independent. He sets out his views in unvarnished fashion in private, but then implements what anyone wants. And for him to feel he can no longer set out his views honestly and frankly to ministers, that they aren't prepared to argue back on this, is really very worrying. If they want to have someone who's a patsy, who agrees with them, then what is the point of having an independent civil service, which is one of the key pillars of our unwritten constitution?
On the other hand, they are civil servants and they have masters, and they're masters of the politicians. They have to do what they're told in the end.
Absolutely. But the point is to have someone who will tell you frankly what the problems are, who will point out to you the elephant traps, who will say these are the things that could go wrong. Then you make your decision as a politician, and the civil servant will then implement them. He will not argue back at that stage, he will implement them. But if you're not prepared to have the argument, if you're not prepared to have someone who will tell you what the problems are, you are going to end up in a disaster. And I'm afraid that's what's going to happen with these negotiations.
How?
If they really go for a patsy.
Why?
Because you won't know what's going to happen. You will live in a miasma of...
You being the Prime Minister, for that matter.
Prime Minister, the ministers, if they do not have civil servants telling them honestly what the other Europeans think, not telling them honestly what is possible to negotiate, they'll live in this fantasy land of what's possible. They'll live in a Daily Mail world of what could be achieved, and they will fail. They have to know what the other side's thinking if they're going to succeed in the negotiations. And we now know that the successor has got to be someone who's pro-Brexit, which is, for a start, a break of the rule we've had of an independent civil service where you must have someone...
A real rule or just a self-imposed?
It's a rule we imposed in the 19th century to get away from the jobbery of the 18th century and the 17th century. We imposed a rule that civil servants were politically neutral, they would serve government of any political colour, and they would do their job to the best of their ability. If we're going to have people who have to be on a particular political colour for a job, the whole system will collapse. If we have to have every civil servant supporting a Tory government, believing the Tories should be in power, the independent system will not work.
Iain Duncan Smith, that is a very worrying scenario.
Well, not really. I think that, with respect to Jonathan, he's overdoing it a little bit. I mean, what I took from this resignation were a couple of points. The first is he knew he was going in the next few months. He was clearly, from his resignation letter, frustrated about what he thinks may be the difference of opinion between his own view about what he thinks is achievable and maybe what ministers think is achievable. This wouldn't be the first time, let me tell you, when ministers have disagreed. And for Jonathan to suggest somehow that you take what a civil servant says to you when you are a cabinet minister, as I was, and say, oh, thank you very much indeed, well, that is absolutely the truth. And the bit that I was
well, that
really
isn't what Jonathan
balked at,
said, though, is it?
Well, hold on a second. In the letter, the email, I thought there was a slightly portentous statement here where he said...
We're talking about, just so people are clear, the letter from Sir Ivan himself.
Yeah, well, email or something that you've got hold of. It says here, don't be afraid to speak truth unto power. Well, the word truth is quite an interesting word. I would say, actually, the word should have been to be opinion. unto power, because I've had many times in the department where I've had civil servants sit in front of me, tell me adamantly that certain things can or cannot be done, and you look at that and you argue back and debate about it and think about it, and then you come back and say, well, there are different ways to do things, and I don't agree with that, and I'm going to do this. Ministers have to make those decisions. That's what they're there for. So I think the key point here is, we forget sometimes that the Civil Service and the Cabinet Secretary made this very clear after the vote. He said the job of the Civil Service now is to deliver on what the democratic mandate was of the British people, and he was right over that.
But
I think the problem right now, well, there's a problem here for the Civil Service as well, and I think this is also illustrative of what that problem is. They have never faced a challenge like this before. They're having to tear up the rule book on what they normally do with regards to their relationships in the European Union, and they are now having to accept and understand that we are leaving, and that means, therefore, sometimes the views and opinions of what you keep feeding back from various member states isn't actually sometimes quite relevant, because, of course, what you are going to be getting from them at this stage is an absolute worst-case scenario. No, you can't have that, you won't get this, you won't achieve that.
And very sensible too, surely. I mean, that's essential.
Well, it's well and good, absolutely right to feed that back. But ministers have to sift that and decide, ultimately, no, what we are going to do is this, and we therefore have to get on and do it like this.
Right,
and if you don't agree, I have full respect for him, then you have to go. But I think there are plenty of other civil servants, and by the way, they don't have to be absolute advocates of leaving the European Union. They simply have to accept that when push comes to shove, they must deliver on what that mandate
Jonathan
was to
Powell
leave the European Union.
And Jonathan Powell, he was able to do those things. He was able to tell his political masters what he thought. He didn't have to go, did he? Wasn't he making almost a political point by going?
No, Number 10 last night were briefing, it was just a routine move. He was going in November anyway. Now they've briefed this morning that he jumped before he was pushed, that they were actually going to get rid of him.
He didn't have to write that letter or that email, did he?
Well, he wrote a farewell email to his colleagues. And frankly, the thing that's really worrying about that email to which Iain Duncan Smith referred is the fact that there isn't a plan. There are no objectives. The government does not, if the ambassador to the EU does not know now, 2 months before we start the negotiation, what the objectives are for those negotiations, it means what we all fear is true. There is no plan.
Right.
And that's the really worrying thing.
And Iain Duncan Smith, that is really worrying, isn't it? Is it your view that there is no... Is he right? Is Sir Ivan right when he says there is no plan, no objective?
Well, that's not my view and my conversations with ministers over this.
You believe they do have a clear objective, they know what it is,
yes.
they're just not telling us. And by the way, I should just intercede at this point to make that we did obviously ask for a minister or somebody from the government to talk to us about it, and they didn't want to, which you may suggest reinforces the idea that perhaps they don't want to be questioned about it because there is no objective.
Well, no, because Theresa May made it very clear that what she's not going to do is discuss the overall negotiating strategy, and I think she's right to do that. And by the way,
the objective, not the overall negotiating strategy.
Hold on a second. It also proves that she's right to say that they weren't going to invoke Article 50 till the end of March, when everybody else was saying you've got to get on with it and do it before Christmas. I think by and large she's been right to keep this balance, because she wants to make sure she's looked at every option and then comes forward in her own way with what she wants. And I don't, by the way, agree with Jonathan on this at all, over this idea that somehow all he did was write a little email to various other of his colleagues. He knew very well what he was doing, probably also knew very well what he was doing when that previous email got leaked. You know, it gets to a point when a civil servant starts to go public on stuff that you, as ministers, can no longer trust that individual. You must have absolute trust and cooperation, and you cannot have this stuff coming out publicly. And this is now, the second time. It may actually prove that ministers may well be right to say that they weren't prepared, perhaps, to trust him in quite the way they would have done with others. There are plenty of other civil servants who didn't behave like this, and I think this is a bit of a problem for the civil service if you're going to start going public when you disagree with a minister.
Put that aside. It's an important point, as you say, but put that aside for a moment. Doesn't the Prime Minister have to tell us at some point before the end of February, because we're talking about March and there isn't very long to go and all that, doesn't she have to tell us at the very least whether she would like this country to remain in the single market or the customs union or whatever? Surely she has to do that. And if she doesn't know whether she wants to do that, that is in itself deeply worrying, isn't it?
No, I think what you're looking at the moment is a government that has to decide on balance what is the best way to leave the European Union. We forget what Article 50 is all about. Article 50 is two elements. The first element of Article 50 is discussing how and when
I'm not
you
talking
actually
about
make
that.
various arrangements. So, well, no, it's important, this.
You want to
Because
accept
the
that what
second
we are
element
talking about is
about
the
what the
objective.
next bit of the relationship is like.
Yeah,
So
all
that
right.
is critical. Now, the argument at the moment with the European Union and the Commission is also an argument with the nation states and the Commission. The Commission does not want to have parallel negotiations over what relationship we have. Many of the nation states do want that to happen. So in a sense, it's all very well and good to say the UK government doesn't know its own position. The truth is the European Union doesn't know its own position right now because they're at odds with each other over what they think should happen. For example, Germany was very clear. Mrs. Merkel was very clear the other day at a meeting which a good friend of mine went and attended of senior business people around Europe. And she was quite clear that as far as they were concerned, they would run the negotiations.
All right, look,
because they did not want to have a mess over trade with their best trading partner.
Mrs. Merkel is not the Prime Minister of this country. We have our own Prime Minister. We are entitled, surely, to know from our Prime Minister at this stage whether she wants us to stay in the single market or the customs union, or what and this is Sir Ivan's word, what the objective is. Not the details and how you get there and all the negotiating bits and pieces in between. What is the objective? Do you know what that objective is yourself?
Yes, it's very simple. We are leaving the European Union. We are leaving the rule. Hey, hang on.
That's not me laughing, by the way. That's Jonathan Powell.
Yes, very uproarious.
I know, don't worry, because no, it's absolutely clear. We're leaving the rule of European law. We are taking back control of our borders, which she's made very clear, and we will then look to make arrangements with the European Union over what kind of trading system they would want
after
with
we've
us,
done all
also
that.
including
So
our services.
after we've done all that,
is
we will
yes, but the key point here that has been confusing to everybody is the idea that somehow you can stay in the single market, but the European Union does not want us to do that because we are not going to have freedom of movement. That has now moved on to the customs union. And the jewel in the crown of what we do when we leave is to set trade arrangements with the rest of the world and therefore improve our trading system. What we don't want to do is end up inside a customs union, unable therefore to set trading arrangements. After all, there would be little or no point in leaving the European
What's wrong with
Union
that, Jonathan Powell?
Well, I've spent 40 years of my life negotiating, and mainly for the government. And there's a big difference between what your objectives are in a negotiation and what your strategy and your tactics are. I don't think anyone is suggesting the government should reveal what its strategy or its tactics are. Of course, you keep those to yourself. But if you don't know what your objectives are when you go into a negotiation, you're bound to end up with a complete mess.
But you might know. You might just not want to tell him.
No, you have to set out those objectives clearly. So if Theresa May is going to set out a plan in the next couple of weeks, as she suggests, before we start these negotiations, she needs to be clear. Are we staying in the single market or leaving the single market? Are we staying in the customs union or are we leaving the customs union? And are we or are we not going to have a transitional agreement? And as she's clear on those 3 points, it is not a plan. It's simply saying, yet again, Brexit means Brexit, which means nothing.
All right. And on that particular point, that narrow point, Iain Duncan Smith, do you agree with Jonathan Powell?
Yes, I agree in this sense that the government will and has to lay out its strategy as to how it intends to approach the negotiations. But I also say that what we want and what we decide we might want is also irrelevant until we know what the other side actually wants and what they're saying. And here's the key point. As I come back to this again, we tend to go on about what do we want the whole time. The truth is, the European Union itself is very divided about what they actually want in their relationship with the UK. And that has become very apparent, even in the last few weeks and months. So these are opinions from a civil servant who disagrees with government. They are not tablets of stone, and the government knows where it's going, and it needs civil servants that will implement that.
Iain Duncan Smith, Jonathan Powell, thank you both very much.